a complete abdication of responsibility when it comes to crime. My guest this afternoon, my colleague at the America First Policy Institute, is Scott Erickson. He is the director of our Center for Law and Justice. Prior to that, he was the chief of staff to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and spent 20 years in uniform as a police officer in San Jose, California. There is probably no greater expert on crime and policing and justice than Scott Erickson. Scott, welcome to the Twitter space today.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be with you.
So, I mean, we have to start here, and it's beyond sad. Every weekend, every Monday, we come in, and the headlines from many of the major cities in America, whether it's New York City, whether it's definitely Chicago, you know, dozens hurt, 8 people killed. We see what's going on in Chicago, where young people are rioting and looting, and we see this continuously happening over and over again. And as someone who has dedicated his entire life and career to law enforcement, to justice, I mean, what do you see when you see this every week?
Yeah, I mean it's dispiriting. It's sad. I think it's sort of a byproduct of our permissiveness in some parts of the country. We've basically allowed things, behavior that we would otherwise condemn and we would hold people responsible. We just stopped doing that. And so the more and more that you allow people to engage in behavior that you don't want them to engage in, and you do nothing to stop them, the more they're going to do it. And Chicago this past weekend is a good example of that, with the at least hundreds, it seemed like, of younger people sort of overtaking part of downtown and engaging in widespread criminal behavior. I mean, it's to the point where the police are so outnumbered, and the system itself in some of these communities is so fundamentally broken and backwards that there's not much that can be done. I mean, unless you completely sort of flip on its head the way you approach criminal justice in its entirety.
One of the things that was most discouraging to me, and prior to working in national politics here in Washington, D.C., I spent a number of years as the communications director for the mayor of Indianapolis, Indiana, when it was run by a Republican mayor. In fact, it was the largest city in America that had a Republican mayor for much of that time. And so I obviously take law and order, a relationship with our police officers, very seriously. I'm the son of a city police officer myself. And when I look to see the comments that were made by the mayor elect, and I will state it is the mayor elect, so he's actually not the mayor yet, of Chicago, when he gives the whole, yes, we condemn violence, we condemn destruction, but then goes on to basically say it's not constructive to demonize the youth and blame society, blame racism, for these incidents, and actually compares it to, basically a protected protest. I mean, it just shows you what is coming next for America's third largest city.
Yeah, that election was sort of a shock, and considering how crime has sort of gone off the deep end in Chicago, among other cities, of course, but Chicago in particular, it's surprising that a candidate that campaigned actively on essentially following the same path as his predecessor, won. And it doesn't speak well for the future, the next few years in Chicago, at least from a law and justice or a law and order standpoint. But again, this is more of the same, right? It's not holding people accountable for their behavior. At the end of the day, the bottom line is it's about behavior, and people need to be held accountable. And we have a system in place to do that, but it only works if you actually enforce the laws.
One of the things that, obviously I noted, and I'm reading from an article here in the Washington Examiner, in from year over year, with every basically crime category except for murder is up in the city of Chicago. Vehicle thefts 135% up, robbery 22%, burglary or theft 22, robbery 15, burglary 6, aggravated battery 4%, criminal sexual assault. These are impacting innocent people who are just trying to live their lives in the cities that they love, whether it is Chicago or, obviously, as we've seen more recently, and it was highlighted earlier this week, what's going on in the city of New York.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think again, it boils down to what's your approach to crime and justice in society. Do you take a victim first approach or do you take a criminal first approach? And I think too many of these cities have subordinated the interests of law abiding citizens to the interests of the criminal class. And I don't understand it. It's very hard to comprehend and get your head around, especially when you see the real world implications of adopting that type of policy. But that's exactly what's going on in places like Chicago, New York, here in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, far too many communities around the country.
A lot of people, try to say that this is just a law enforcement. This is just a police issue. And I think that obviously going back into my own history in Indianapolis, that just oversimplifies it. And I think with your background, whether we see it in New York, whether we see it in Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, I mean, you name the major city that's run by a leftist, and it's all going to be the same answer. There's only so much police can do in these situations.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't arrest your way out of the situation if the rest of the criminal justice infrastructure fails to uphold its end of the bargain, right? If the cops go out there and make the tough arrests and get the bad guys off the street, that's only a temporary fix if the district attorney is unwilling to charge those people and pursue charges uh, to the end. If that doesn't happen, the people go right back onto the streets. And unfortunately, when that happens, you also have the demoralization of the police department itself, and you see this sort of phenomenon of depolicing, where cops stop engaging in the type of proactive police work that really actually reduces crime in a society instead of just being responsive to crime. And we've seen that. They called it the Ferguson effect. About 5, 6, 7 years ago, after the riots at Ferguson and whatnot, cops pulled back, stopped doing the type of proactive policing again that actually reduces crime. And again, the only people that suffer are law-abiding citizens.
This leads us into an area where you've done a lot of research with the uh, AFPI Center for Law and Justice. I mean, it's almost a poster child definition of what these woke prosecutors are actually doing, because we're seeing in, say, New York City, where obviously a lot of attention has been paid to District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who has nothing to brag about in terms of crime in New York City, but he's actually reducing most of the felonies to misdemeanors and turning these criminals back onto the streets.
Yeah, again, I mean, it's sort of it's hard to understand the motivation behind doing that. We see it in New York, we see it in Washington D.C. San Francisco had a huge problem with that when Chesa Boudin, the now former district attorney, was elected and came into office a couple years ago. But in communities that are run by these progressive sort of rogue prosecutors, um, uh, you know, that's the common theme, right? They drop cases, they reduce charges. Uh, all of this stuff happens, and what correspondingly happens, crime goes up. It's no surprise, right? You're not holding people accountable for their behavior. In New York, as an example, um, sort of related to this, in 2020, in the midst of the sort of BLM inspired defund the police, the riots, all that chaos that ensued in 2020, police officers pulled back, and you saw a 38% decrease in the number of arrests and stops in New York. And guess what happened? They saw during the same period of time a 58% rise in homicides. Those are two related phenomena.
One of the things that really strikes me, I know this from my experience in Indianapolis. You know this from your experience, well, throughout many levels of law enforcement, and I've seen uh, a little reporting on this in the media. Is that in most of these major cities, there is, and it varies obviously by locale, but there's basically a known group of offenders that the police know, and yet they are not able to take them off the street.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Oftentimes, some of the most violent crime that happens in a community is committed by a subset of a small subset of society. So, and the police are familiar with these frequent offenders. There was a statistic, I think, in New York that came out recently that I think the police had identified something like 300 or so individuals who had been responsible over the past few years for 6,000 crimes or 6,000 arrests. I mean, it's unbelievable how much people can and will get away with, again, if you simply refuse to hold them to account. And that's the problem. We know the solution. It's not like we have to search, it's not rocket science. We don't need to figure out how to solve this. We know how to solve it. In the 1990s, the nation adopted a much more aggressive posture toward law and order and policing in society, and we saw a dramatic decline in crime throughout the nation, and we sustained reduced levels of crime up until a couple of years ago. So that's the problem. We've had it, good for so long with respect to violent crime in society. If you look at it on a per capita basis, that what we're experiencing now is so out of the ordinary. But unfortunately, we haven't sort of seen the inverted V going back to pre 2020 levels. They've plateaued, and now this is becoming sort of the new normal, and that's simply unacceptable.
So that brings me to the kind of, I mean, think about this, and we saw it on display during the congressional hearing on Monday in Manhattan. These are criminals who weren't locked up on their first arrest, or their second arrest, or maybe even their 19th arrest, but it took the 20th, the 30th arrest. I mean, think about the victims of crime, whether it was violent, whether it was just what would be considered more of a minor or a theft or a vandalism. But think about the damage done because these woke prosecutors and the judges won't do their jobs and basically apply penalties to these crimes. So, what do we have to do? I mean, obviously, we have to identify the problem. Do you think enough people out there know what's going on?
I think more and more people know what's going on because crime has begun to infiltrate communities that have historically been insulated from this type of crime. And I think it's a sad sort of indictment on the way we approach crime in society, where we kind of ignore it if it's not happening right in front of our face or it doesn't seem to affect us personally. But I think that's what you're seeing in more communities. Here in DC is a good example of even violent crime that's sort of infiltrating parts of the community downtown and Capitol Hill and areas where it's just not that common, or it hasn't been that common. Um, and once you see that, and once people start to experience it on a day-to-day basis, or at least someone, or someone who knows someone who's been the victim of in particular a violent crime, then people start to take notice. And look, I get it. People, there's room for compassion. There's room for second chances. But at the end of the day, compassion has to be held out most for the victims of society. Compassion has to be held out for the law-abiding individuals who go about their business every day just trying to make our country work. And that's really where we should have our priorities set.
Well, and obviously this is something I should never do, but I'll invent some policy here for you, Scott, right on the surface here on the spot. But I think this is one of those areas where I would really encourage everyone listening. And I used to, obviously, in addition to my public service, I worked in the media back at the beginning of my career. We should demand that our local media, whether that's radio, television, newspapers, when they're reporting on a crime, they're reporting on the arrest of a suspect in the crime, we should start to demand that they say how many times they've been arrested before. Let's start really highlighting how many times these people have been arrested before and let go, because then possibly maybe the people out there will start to hold these prosecutors. And in many cases, these prosecutors are elected at the local levels. Maybe that will start to hold them accountable for why has this person been arrested and released so many times before.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we always hear the same thing. It's the same story over and over. An individual commits a horrible crime, and then we dig a few layers into the person's past, and you realize, oh, they've been arrested 5 times for this or that, or they were released early for some reason. And people always say, why did that happen? Why did that happen? Well, it happens because we put into office and into positions of power people who continue to do the same thing and follow the same failed policies and policy ideas. And again, accountability, we talk about it a lot here today and in general in law and justice, but it's not just for criminal offenders. It's for the people that we are entrusting to uphold the law for us on our behalf. There has to be accountability for them as well. So it really is about an informed electorate who understands the policy decisions, the implications of their decision on who to put into office.
One of the things that I think some of the work that you've done has been so great in this area. And granted, I admit, obviously Alvin Bragg gets a lot of the focus because of his horrible record against criminals, and then obviously, some of the selective political persecutions that he is engaged in. But it's not just New York, Chicago, Philly, and San Francisco. I mean, you've identified that many cities, including many cities where you may not know, are actually these woke rogue prosecutors who are funded by international leftist organizations.
Yeah, there's studies have shown that there's a minimum probably of at least 75 or so of these sort of Soros-funded progressive prosecutors that are operating all throughout the country in dozens and dozens of states. And so it's not, like you said, it's not just the big cities, the sort of usual suspects where you would expect, bad policy to sort of prevail, but it's all around us. And again, the people have to just to become more aware of what's going on, be more aware again of policy decisions that people in office are making and how those decisions affect everyone's daily life. Unfortunately, in something like this, it could be in a very tangible and very unfortunate way with respect to crime.
One of the things that gives me a lot of hope is that, we did see the issue of crime influence the outcome of elections in 2022, especially as it was related to New York and more New York State, not New York City. But then you go and we look at what just recently happened in the city of Chicago. You know, I think as more and more people become aware of this, and we've seen recall efforts, we've successful recall efforts. We've seen some governors remove these woke prosecutors from office. I think the American people are actually are standing up and saying we're tired of it.
Yeah, I think you're right, and hopefully that's a trend that continues. I mean, San Francisco is a great example. Obviously, a very proudly progressive city amongst the most liberal in the country, and they elected and put into office Chesa Boudin, who ran again very proudly on a quote unquote reform agenda, and his policies were disastrous, predictably so. But the people there turned around and recalled him and kicked him out of office, and that's that if San Franciscans can kick out a far left progressive prosecutor because they realized how disastrous the policies are, then anyone else who's empowered to do so should be able to do so. It's just again, it's I sometimes I think people's decisions for and motivations for how they vote vary. It's very idiosyncratic. It all depends on a person's interests and all these things. But at the end of the day, there's very few kitchen table issues as important as you and your family's safety.
Well, and I do think if anything is an indication, I think it is shown that aside from the economy, which is almost always issue number one, crime ranks right up there, and we're seeing it, and it's impacting your local communities. I think the one of the big things, especially on the national news, you're just going to see the bigger examples, the more graphic video caught on tape, or what's going on in New York and Chicago. But for everyone listening, I mean, look at the nearest big city to you. It's probably happening right around your neighborhood. And trust me, it doesn't just confine itself to the inner city. We are seeing more and more examples of crime spreading out to suburban areas and beyond because it just doesn't sit still.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And like you said, it's not just we always hear about the big flashy, usually horrible incidents of violence, but look at the economic impact that theft is having on communities and the quality of life that it's also impacting when people can't even go to a corner store because it's shuttered because it's constantly being looted and nobody is empowered essentially to do anything to stop it. San Francisco's and I use San Francisco as another example. Property crime and vehicle theft, vehicle burglary is through the roof. By far, the worst numbers of any major city in the country. And you have to basically, take everything out of your vehicle and make sure that there's nothing visible if you want to stand a chance of not having your car window broken into overnight. I mean, these are the type of quality of life issues that just eventually build and hopefully people, do something to change it.
And one of the things, even if your car is not stolen, God willing, and hopefully it is not, or it won't be stolen, trust me, if there is an auto theft problem in your area, you will be paying for it via higher auto insurance rates because the insurance companies aren't going to lose money on this. They're going to raise rates in the areas where it happens, whether you live or are directly impacted or not.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Or in the case of businesses, they're simply going to move out and they're not going to do business in that area because it's not worth their time.
Which is also then going to lead to lower job opportunities, which is going to increase, obviously, illicit activities such as gangs in inner cities and things like that. I mean, this is all interconnected.
It's absolutely all interconnected. And look, I mean, the economy, as you said, is always usually the number one issue on voters' minds and people's minds. But at the end of the day, if you don't feel comfortable or safe sending your your child out to walk to school or just to play out in the front yard. I mean, that alone, that has to tell you something. If you're not comfortable with where you're living because of that, then that tells you there's a big problem. And we've seen people move. You know, the out migration from some of these cities is pretty dramatic, and it's no small part due to the crime.
So what else can people do? I mean, tell us a little bit about the work you guys are doing and how people can use that and look into seeing what's going on and maybe start to have that discussion in their own neighborhoods so they can rally their forces together and seek change at the ballot box.
Look, I think the first thing you have to do is educate yourself and become aware of the issue at the sort of the 30,000 foot level, and then in a more granular way. And at the Center for Law and Justice, we produced papers on progressive prosecutors. We've highlighted a number of cities where their policies have been particularly um, particularly bad for the community. We look at law enforcement and the recruiting and retention problem and crisis that's afflicting the profession. It's a generational crisis. I don't think a lot of people realize that we just can't hire, we can't get enough people to want to become police officers, let alone pay them enough. It's not even about the money. People want to do it, and you can understand why. But all of these things, this confluence of events from, you know, part of it resulting from the defund the police movement and this sort of general anti-law enforcement wave that started about the most recent wave starting about 8 years ago, 9 years ago. But all of these things contribute to the decline in public safety that we're experiencing today. So the best thing people can do is, again, become educated on the issues. Go to our website, go to AFPI's website, and read our material. Arm yourself with fact sheets and just become more acquainted with conversationally with discussing these issues so that when you engage your family and your friends, you're able to do so from a position of strength.
Well, that's great. That's great advice, Scott. And for those of you listening, you can go to americafirstpolicy.com. Follow us on at A1 Policy on Twitter, as obviously you can see there at the top of your screen. We put all of this information out there for the public. We're going to be very aggressive on this weaponization of government issue and these soft on crime policies because they do translate to more than just crime rates. It impacts the economy. It impacts your home value. It impacts your quality of life. To Scott Erickson, thank you for joining me. We will continue to do more of these on various topics, and I'm sure we will have Scott back soon. Thanks to all of our listeners, and have a safe drive home and a great rest of your evening. Thank you.